Good morning. Today we are going to be looking at Jesus' arrest and his initial or the beginning part of his trials before the Sanhedrin, or the Synedrion is probably the better term, which is the actual Greek. So we're going to be looking at Jesus as he's coming to the very end of his ministry. And we're coming upon, of course, this is all part of Holy Week. This is taking place on what we tend to call Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Easter, the evening before Good Friday. And so we're going to look at two separate Gospels for part of this, actually. I'm going to look at John 18 for his arrest, and then for his appearance before the Synedrion, I'm going to look at Matthew 26 for today. So let's take a look at Jesus' ministry. And as you know, I'll just say one thing about Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, and I'm sure you may have noticed this, but the Gospels are highly centered upon the last week of Jesus' ministry and his crucifixion. Have you noticed that? That in reality, an inordinate amount of time is spent during this last week. The Gospels are almost a focus on the very end of Jesus' ministry, and then the other year or years before this, when Jesus is ministering, are covered, much more spottily. But the last week is really covered extensively in all four Gospels. All right, and so it's almost like it's a passion narrative with a prologue on the Gospels in certain ways. So we're coming here where this is Maundy Thursday. This is Jesus has had the Last Supper with his disciples. Of course, John doesn't tell us about the Last Supper because it's been covered in the other Gospels. But John includes something that isn't in the other Gospels that happens during the Last Supper, and that is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So it says in John 18, verse 1, when Jesus had finished praying, he left with his disciples, and he crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, of course, the garden in Gethsemane, and he and his disciples went into it. So, okay, it's thought that Jesus' Last Supper was probably in the Essene Quarter, likely in the Essene guest house that's in Jerusalem over on Mount Zion. Okay, they get done with the Last Supper, and then they travel across, and they go outside of Jerusalem, outside the city walls, and they cross the Kidron Valley, which is right next to Jerusalem, real close to the temple, runs along the temple, and then just across that is the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. And Gethsemane, just a little reminder, Gethsemane means olive press. So there is obviously an olive press here. And olive presses tended to be in caves because it kept the temperature on an even temperature for both storage as well as processing olives, and even other things, such as you could process grapes for wine, etc., in this too. And one of the possibilities is, once again, a reminder, this is Passover. So Jerusalem is not just filled to overflowing with people for the Passover festival, the Passover feast, but in fact there's probably at least 1 million people, 1 million Jews are here at Jerusalem in a town of 50,000 people. So you've got people camping out all over the hillsides. And I suspect that Jesus and his disciples, what they're doing at the Garden of Gethsemane, is that they're going to sleep in the olive press, because that would be someplace inside. It'd be an even temperature. It'd be probably a good place to stay, to camp out. And it looks like Jesus spent a fair amount of time there with his disciples, perhaps over the years even, the different times when they would come to Jerusalem at the different festivals. So they're going to the garden that's in or on Gethsemane, on the Mount of Olives. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, of course, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. See, and that's one thing we tend to forget. In this day and age where we have pictures of everyone all over the place, and we have all kinds of lighting, we don't have problem recognizing people indoors because there's electric lighting, and we don't have trouble outdoors because there's street lamps, and you've got flashlights and all sorts of things. But it's not that way in Jesus' day, of course, is it? There is no such thing as photography. So most people are not going to know what Jesus looks like. Judas, number one, he has to go and take part in the arrest because he knows what Jesus looks like. He knows where Jesus is going to be. And so there's no way you're going to arrest Jesus without someone who knows him and knows where he's going to be. So Judas came to the garden, guiding, and this is important. Now, there are differences in translations in some of our English translations, and they really cloud the issue, I'm afraid, on a lot of these things. He's guiding, literally, it's a cohort of soldiers. And also, some other people that are from the chief priests and Pharisees. Kind of interesting. It often is translated as either leaders or servants, and yet the Greek term is kind of weird. It literally means under rowers, in terms of like rowing on a boat, if you've got rowers on a boat. And one thing that can mean is lictors. And that's probably what we're talking about here, are lictors. Lictors are specific servants to both Roman officials and also, I would assume, for the chief priests and the Synedrion. Lictors are the ones who carry out, for instance, official beatings and things. Roman lictors, were ones who went with the Roman governor, and they carried what's called the fasces. And it's a bundle of rods or twigs with an axe in it. All right, and that's the symbol of the governor's power of life and death. See, in a Roman province, there's only one person who carries the fasces, who has the authority of the fasces, the authority, the power of life and death, and that is the prefect or the governor, the person who's in charge, who's been named specifically by the emperor, because you have to remember Judea, which does not include Galilee or Perea or any of the other things, but just Judea is a Roman province. And the Roman prefect, who has the authority of fasces, is Pontius Pilate. He's been appointed as governor by the emperor himself because Judea is what's called an imperial province, which means that the emperor names the governor. See, other provinces are senatorial provinces. And those are served by senators, and the Senate names them. But these imperial provinces, like Judea, the emperor himself appoints an equestrian military governor, a prefect. And that's who Pontius Pilate is. And so he's got the power of life and death. But he's got these lectors who carry the fasces. And so they're the ones that carry out the beatings. If you're going to get whipped as a punishment for an offense, it's the lictors that are going to carry that out. And so that's likely who these people are that are from the chief priests and Pharisees. They could be leaders under the chief priests and the Pharisees, or they could just be servants, but it's kind of interesting to think about. But let's focus on this cohort. What's a cohort? A cohort is 600 men. That's 1/10 of a Roman legion. All right? That's very specific in terms of what this is. So this, John is telling us something that the other Gospels are not. John is saying that there's a cohort, there's 600 soldiers that Judas has been given. along with other officials or people from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they're carrying torches and lanterns, and it says, and weapons, which makes sense if it's a cohort of soldiers, right? Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus, the Nazarene," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas, the traitor, was standing there with them. And when Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus, the Nazarene," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." And then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it. And it says sword, but that can mean a knife. It's non-specific. It's makairos. And it can be anything from a fairly good-sized knife, like a butcher knife, or it can be a small sword. It's just a generic term, so we don't know much from that. Anyway, and it's very common to be carrying, especially a knife, isn't it? Especially if you're a fisherman, or just in general, if you're traveling on the highways and things, there are lots of robbers, lots of people, and so you're going to have a knife with you both for practical purposes and maybe for self-defense. So he drew it, and he struck the high priest's slave, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus, which means king, ironically, because it says literally, some of the translations are the high priest's servant, but literally the word is doulo, which means slave, or doulos. And so it's his slave, or, somebody who's serving the high priest. Ironically, his name is King, Malchus. King is the slave's name. And so it's interesting to think about what Peter's intending to do here. Is he taking an actual sword, is it like a gladius, a short sword, like a Roman sword? And is he coming down on the head of, the high priest's slave and intending to split his head open, kill him? Is that what his intent is? Is he intending to defend Jesus and keep him from being arrested? Or interesting, is it more of a, and he misses and just cuts off his ear instead? He's not a very good aim. Or there's maybe an even better explanation for that, is that this is the high priest's servant or slave. And we don't know what his duties are for the high priest, but if he's serving in the temple, there's a requirement for those serving in the temple. And you cannot be deformed. And I'm wondering if Peter is just intentionally cutting off part of his ear, because if he cuts off part of his ear, then he is no longer fit to serve in the temple. He would no longer be allowed to serve in the temple. So I just wonder if that's the kind of retribution that Peter is meting out, or if he's just being Peter and being rash and not thinking, and and not a very good aim. I don't know. It's interesting. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put away your sword. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" It says, then the cohort of soldiers with its tribune, okay? A tribune is a commander of 1,000, okay? That's an important, relatively high military position. And with the terms that are being used and the fact that they're coming with Judas from the temple, and remember, there is a cohort of Roman soldiers, probably Roman auxiliary soldiers, who are not normal Roman troops, not normal Roman legions, but auxiliary. There is a cohort that is permanently stationed in the Antonia fortress, which is connected to the temple of Jerusalem. Okay, and that cohort, there is a cohort that stays there permanently. And because of the festival, Pilate has come with other cohorts to try to keep order during the festivals, because there's 1 million people here, and there was always a big problem and a big threat of riot and insurrection and unrest. And so the Roman governor would always come with the troops that he could. Now, Pilate does not have command of many troops. This is not an occupation force in the way you would think of it. That often is misportrayed. This is the Roman province of Judea. And yes, a lot of the people maybe in Judea are not very happy that the Romans are taxing them and different things. But Pilate only has command of 6 cohorts, a total of 3,600 men for the entire province. Okay. And a lot of those are stationed in the capital at Caesarea Maritima, where Pilate governs from. And then there is a cohort that's permanently kept at the Antonia fortress next to the temple. But at least one of the cohorts, it looks like, of Roman soldiers has been given to Judas to go and make this arrest. So they're expecting trouble potentially, right? So the cohort of soldiers with its tribune, the commander of not just the cohort, but of more than the cohort, and the Jewish officials arrest Jesus, and they bound him. And one of the interesting things is that Judas is probably, he's not just the person who identifies Jesus, but he's the main accuser. In Roman law, for instance, there really isn't such a thing as a police force, not really. At least, for instance, if somebody has done something and you want to charge them with it, there isn't a prosecutor, a state prosecutor who does it. No, you, who are the concerned party, need to arrest that person yourself and haul him before the magistrate. And so that's what Judas is doing. He's the main accuser who's bringing the charge against Jesus, I would suggest to you. And so he, Judas, and the cohort of soldiers and others arrest Jesus. Now, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay? They took him to Caiaphas, the high priest. And he is the high priest that year. Matter of fact, he's been high priest for a while. He serves at the discretion of the Roman prefect. But it's the family of Annas, his father-in-law, that have control of the high priesthood. And Caiaphas is the high priest. And Annas was the high priest. He got replaced at a certain point, but he still is the power behind the throne. Okay, so Caiaphas then is there with the teachers of the law and the elders. They had assembled the Synedrion, the council, the ruling council of Judea under Pontius Pilate. But Peter followed at a distance right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the servants, under rowers, lictors, to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Synedrion were looking for false testimony, it says, against Jesus so that they could put him to death. They wanted to be done with him. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." It's interesting, it doesn't say who the false witnesses are. And I think it's virtually certain that it's Judas who is the key witness, because that's his job. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. Now that's very unusual, because in Roman trials, your testimony, your argument in your defense was everything. See, virtually everything in a trial in Roman times was a matter of talking. It was a matter of testimony. It was a matter of argument. And your best defense was your own testimony if you're being charged with something, and also that you've got a good person, not a lawyer per se, not in the way we think of it, but you've got someone who's acting as your lawyer, acting as your representative, who is very good at speaking. For instance, Cicero, the famous Roman rhetorician Cicero, was a famous lawyer, you might say, because he brought cases against people, and he also defended people against cases. And he was very good at it, very good at arguing, very good at presenting a defense orally. It's not a matter of evidence so much as it is talk. And if you will not talk, you will not be found not guilty. You will be found guilty. If you don't offer a defense, if you are silent, you will be found guilty. Everyone knows this. Jesus remained silent. Probably because, it's a kangaroo court. The outcome is certain. Jesus is not going to dignify that with a defense. But it's very unusual not to have someone defend themselves or to have somebody defend them for them. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Now you have to remember, whenever you hear the word Messiah, what that means. Messiah literally means anointed one. It's literally the same word, means the same thing as the Greek word Christ. They're interchangeable. Messiah is derivative from the Hebrew, meaning anointed one, and Christ is Greek, meaning anointed one. And in turn, what does that mean? The anointed one is who? The King. This isn't necessarily, when you talk about somebody being the Christ or the Messiah, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the Son of God or that they're divine or anything else. That means, David was the Messiah. He was the king. So was Solomon. Solomon was the Messiah. He was the king. He was anointed as king, right? So these are two different things. The high priest says, tell us if you are the Messiah, the anointed king, the Son of God. All right, and Son of God doesn't even necessarily mean what we think it means in terms of being divine, because in a sense we're all sons of God, and especially the King of Israel would be Son of God. See? So there's not necessarily a supernatural or divine intent coming from the high priest's question. He's just saying, tell us plainly if you are the king. If you are God's selected king, tell us. And now the high priest has a vested interest you have to keep in mind too. Because who were the kings before the Romans came and exerted authority? It was the high priest. You have to remember that. Under the Hasmoneans, or what's called the Maccabees, those mean the same thing basically. Before Roman domination, who was it that ruled Judea? The high priest was king as well as high priest. Okay, and so Caiaphas probably views himself as the rightful king of Judea in reality. And so he's asking Jesus, well, do you claim to be the king? I'm the real king. Do you claim to be king? And Jesus responds, well, you have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now see, there's one of these things we get messed up on. Jesus says, Son of Man. His number one term for himself, Jesus' number one term for himself is not Christ, it's not Messiah, it's not Son of God. It's Son of Man. And why is that? Because Son of Man, it means the opposite of what we often think it means. Son of Man is a direct reference to prophecies in the Old Testament in books like Daniel, where the figure of the Son of Man is a divine being. That's why Jesus calls himself Son of Man. And the Chief Priests and the Synedrion, the Pharisees, the scribes, they understand what he's saying. From now on, you will see the Son of Man, the divine Son of Man, sitting at the right hand of God and coming in the clouds of heaven. That is a clear, unmistakable claim by Jesus that he indeed is the Son of Man. He is God in human flesh. He's the one that's been prophesied in the Old Testament. He is the one. And then the high priest tears his clothes. Says, he's spoken blasphemy. See, he's claimed to be equal with God. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. You have heard the blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard. What do you think? He is worthy of death, the members of the Synedrion answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, King, or Anointed One, Messiah, who hit you? And then early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. And that's because in a Roman province, only the Roman prefect, the Roman governor, has authority of life and death. Only he can execute someone. The Synedrion, the ruling council of Judea, they have authority to do everything up to execution. They can punish Jesus however they want to apart from that, but they cannot execute him. And so they're making plans how to deliver him over to Pilate and to convince Pilate he's worthy of death. So we come to this place. And what do we see when we see Jesus' trial and crucifixion? We see the ultimate rebellion of human beings. We want to be in control, and we rebel against God. Where are you at right now? Have you rebelled against God? Have you tried to maintain control of your life? We're all rebels. And that's not something to revel in. That tends to be something that we take pride in a lot of times as sinful human beings. Oh yeah, I'm a rebel. And we like to appear to be rebels. But that's not a good thing. We're rebellious. We're in rebellion against God. Because we want to be in control, just like this Synedrion and the chief priests, they wanted to be in control. But you know, the funny thing is, God came in the form of Jesus Christ to die for our sins to save us. And you know, that's all of us. Even the chief priests and the Synedrion. You realize that? There's no one that can't be forgiven by God. Jesus died for the sins of the world, not just for some of the sins, all the sins of the world. And all we have to do to receive forgiveness and eternal life is simply to confess our rebellion and place our faith in Jesus and his finished work on the cross. He came to die for you and for me, and even for the chief priests and the Synedrion. Are you a rebel? Well, give up on that. It's not going to end well. Instead, have faith in Jesus. Amen.